Jamie Conoway, I envy you. You have access to real wilderness. I do not. This is one of the letdowns of my life story. I got to live in the Pacific Northwest for 10 years. I got to interact with old growth forests and walk the same trails multiple times through multiple seasons. So I got to learn how everything communicates biochemically in layer upon layer upon layer of relationship, experience, and ultimately blooms, which are what relationships and experience are ultimately grains of with each other. And this, unfortunately, is my reality now. Cow farms and cornfields in rural Minnesota as far as the eye can see. I'm here largely because I have multiple disabilities. I get frequent cancers, and other fun stuff. So I'm a participant at the world famous Mayo Clinic for my various disabling diseases. Go me. Good news so far is that treatment has been resoundingly successful for just about everything except for my GI issues, a little something called bile acid diarrhea. I'm actually having to move to a new community to figure that one out. Nevertheless, so let's talk consciousness. One of the things that really fascinated me with I'm sure in Brazil you've got to know about ayahuasca and yage, and I haven't done those. Well, that's not true. I've microdosed ayahuasca a lot. I'm generally not a fan of hallucinogens. I do like dimethyltryptamine. I don't like it. I had a very positive experience on it. I had a very life-changing experience on it. But generally, and this was a big dispute in my marriage. My ex-husband was a big advocate of ayahuasca, mushrooms, and psilocybin, and I was not. While he was taking those shortcuts, I was doing 2 45-minute sits a day. My morning sit was Zazen, and my evening sit was Tonglen. And those really led me to some fucking fantastic places. But I'm also an economist and a data guy and a compliance guy. So I'm really very, very interested ultimately in behaviors. Suppositions, shoulds, whys, things are supposed to, I don't care, right? I don't care. I don't care about money I don't have. I don't care about how things should work out. Those are just sketches, those are ideas, they're nice to have, but ultimately you can't count your chickens before you're hatched. And behavior is really what's consequential. Your body is an instrument, and that instrument marks and plays the world. That's one of the central tenets of Bloom theory. As we sort of examine our relationship to the world around us, we have to look at how our bodies have very much changed. Just look at all that. All that corn, ultimately, is a sign that somebody's hands, right, amplified by farm machinery, has completely changed the direct chemistry, physiology, and even geology of this landscape, right? And that's ultimately what we do. When you look at human purpose, we physically and chemically transform our world. So in my greater theoretical work, particularly and notably in this relational universe, which is where I make so far 4 additions to Einstein's work, I'm about to post a few more. Relativity 5 is macroorganism theory. And what macroorganism theory says is that everything is a cell in something else, right? So this idea that the cellular organization of the universe somehow terminates with us is absurd. We are also cells in larger organisms. And in the United States, our Supreme Court has recognized this with the legal case Citizens United, in which it conferred personhood upon corporations. And it compelled the legislative branch of our government to spell this out, and they haven't. So this sort of gives corporations in our country unlimited power over our government, because we haven't spelled out, for example, how to criminally prosecute companies when they break criminal laws. Who do you go after? Well, we don't know. There are no laws for that. You know, I'm in a situation right now where a lot of people have hurt me through the years, and they've done so in ways where they've skirted extant criminal laws. So, for example, I know I can go after a lot of them for defamation, but, you know, how do I say, get my service animal back? You know, everybody agrees that the law is broken there, but because I no longer reside in the state where the crime happened in, even though I was there in that state when it happened, because I no longer reside in that state, I might not have standing. You asked about what it's like to live in the United States. Have you read Kafka's The Castle? It's a lot like that. So when I really started getting somewhere with consciousness, one of the things that, you know, I couldn't explore consciousness without reading consciousness theory. And then from there, even though I wasn't happy with or really doing many psychedelics at all, I didn't want to go anywhere near them. I don't enjoy them, largely because the physical sensations are so shitty for me. And I mean, like, once I really got going with meditation, I don't need to see trails, man. I'm an artist. Like, I want to see into time, which is what I can do now. I want to see into your soul, which is what I can do now. I want to know who you've been in prior lifetimes, which is what I can do now. You know, I don't need to see trippy fractals and shit. That doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, that's just, I mean, most of what I experienced on acid and mushrooms, I understood was just basically masturbating the prefrontal visual cortex portions where these two inputs are being stitched into one input. And what I found with most people who are obsessed with psychedelics is that what they're really doing is chasing one big fish story, one really good trip, you know. It's, you know, Alan Watts rightly said of psychedelics, once you get the message, hang up the phone. Right? So I never understood why my husband kept calling back over and over again, because I'm like, you're not getting any new messages out of this shit, dude. Whereas meditation just delivered the goods over and over and over again. And the more curious I was, the farther I could go. And once I started including magic in that, tarot particularly, things really blew up from there. You know, once you start bringing in sacred circles, once you start bringing in potent images, particularly if you're an artist and you can create your own, then you really have this remarkable capacity to shape your journey through consciousness, which is the field that connects us all. Ultimately, awareness is the underlying field beneath all of that. So at the sort of top of the universe, holding down, is the Hindu concept of the Godhead, Brahman, or Brahma, which is in my name, Brandon Heckman. Look at it. Brahma's right there, dude. And then underneath all of that is the detective concept of the universe, which the Greeks named logos, right? Symbol, meaning. So there's always some dance between knowing and perceiving, you know, between the archetypal and the syntactic. And it's not just superficial. It's not just material. Matter has interior depth. This is one of the fundamental problems of physics, is that physics makes a mistake. It says that this is truth. And what that does, what photons do, is cast shadow and reflect color that is not absorbed. That's not the truth. Okay? What I'm doing right now is reporting to you from my center acoustically. That is the truth. Light reflects and shadows. It's not always an accurate measurement of truth. And when we use it as an accurate measurement of truth, usually what we're doing is cutting or smashing, or some derivation thereof, which only exposes more surface area. It doesn't get us to the center of the matter, right? So the more I worked with my own consciousness, the more I realized there really is this kind of interior space within us. And the more I expanded my own awareness, so especially once I got it outside of my own body, and you know, right now I really feel my awareness normally, and right now, in the trees all around us, right? I can feel their processes. I can feel the sap rising and falling. right? I can feel all the insects swarming around me, and I know what's going on inside of them, okay? So, there's an interiority to things. Now, before we really start to probe into that, I want to talk to you about how Ken Wilber's work and Alfred White Northhead's work really changed my thinking on the order of being. And what's interesting is that Whitehead and Wilber came to me when I was really studying consciousness. You know, I started studying Ken Wilber's integral theories when I was interested in pursuing psychology as a second career in my 30s, and I was interested in going to the California Integral Institute of Sciences and getting a psychology certification from them. And Mr. Wilber's work really connects the whole picture together for them. And he presents this ladder of consciousness from the ordinary to the non-dual, ultimately. And I think it's way too linear. I think it's inaccurate based on my own experience. You know, like, I didn't follow Wilber's path to the Godhead, to the non-dual, to one taste. I don't think you would either. But Wilber introduces a concept that Whitehead authors earlier called holons, Holons. You might be already aware of these whole parts. You know, so I'm made of cells. Those cells make up organs, and the cells and organs make up me. It's kind of like a Russian nesting doll, a Kachinka doll, right? And so that's the order of being. Everything nests within itself and rises from itself, from within itself, right? And then in that way, everything blooms out and everything blooms down and in. And that's the sort of fundamental connection of all things. So you can understand in a very real way that that evolution, which is the universe's language of progression, it's the universe's language of change. You know, the universe doesn't want to repeat itself atomically from a particulate perspective. You know, it is interested. It's an art object. It's an object at play fundamentally, and it doesn't want to repeat itself at all. It wants to produce as many utterly unique, extraordinary experiences within the fabric of itself as it possibly can. That's just one of its impetuses, you know. So evolution exists to drive that mechanism. It's a song that propels us to continual change. And Wilber rightly points out that the course of evolution in consciousness, as we grow our consciousness, is to increase both the depth and the span of that conscious penetration into greater being. I absolutely agree with that. And so when he talks about that, he really is rightly talking about the higher you go in consciousness, the greater you're able to access greater depth and span in the holons that you have access to. And I find that is very true as I progress on my consciousness journey. So, for example, one of the interesting things about me working with my medical professionals is that I'm able to manipulate my own DNA. So I can tell them things that are going on. It's really neat. Once you get really far, I mean, it sounds like you're on your way if you're not close enough to right where I am or doing something different but equally important as well. There are a lot of us who are getting here. You and I are not alone. So let's talk physics, because physics and consciousness are really connected, and I would not have been able to make this journey, consciousness journey, nor this corporate journey, without really diving into physics. When I started my journey in 2016, I had left my abusive spouse. I had terminated my relationship. Well, Wells Fargo terminated their relationship with me at long last. Which was long overdue. And, sorry, ragweed. And, I was in an oddball lake house in Wisconsin. We had a nutty parrot. I had an insane poltergeist, man. Every night I'd go to bed, I'd close everything in the house, and I'd wake up the next morning and the neighbors would call me. My service animal was down the street waking them up. My cat was out. Every drawer, every door, wide open, night after night after night. And that's another, how I dealt with the poltergeist is another story. But I think what's was really looking ahead post Wells and asking myself where I wanted to go. And I was really recognizing that I've had this calling my whole life to do something great for all of us. Something significant. I knew from a very early age that these days today were coming. And anyone who's worked with me in finance will tell you that all of my work in finance has been geared at understanding that these days were coming. I've known with a very deep and innate sense all of my life that we are coming, that we are destined to face something like this. And we will either meet the test and prevail, or we will fail to meet the test and the universe will forget us. And my mission is stewardship. Plain and simple. I want to engender and reward a culture of stewardship. I want to see people become profitable as stewards. But this was before all of this. I was reading Emerson's Nature. And it's interesting because Wilbur was really talking about Emerson is a really, I'd read Emerson in high school and he changed my life. And I did have an extraordinary transcendental experience because of Emerson. As a junior in high school, we went to Yosemite and climbed a mountain. And when I reached the top of the mountain, I did indeed have Emerson's experience of the transparent eyeball. And it was astonishing. I wrote about it on my college essays, and of course everybody accepted me for that shit. I had no idea that and of course the first thing that I do in art school is spend the entire first semester exploring all of the implications of that without realizing that what I had done was attain accidentally an early glimpse of a much higher state of consciousness that I wasn't prepared for. The Japanese Zen practitioners would call this Kensho. Ken Wilber refers to this as one taste. Either or. I'm reapproaching Wilber in 2016. Not Wilber, Emerson. Summer 2016, and I'm really sitting down. I skipped the introduction, blown away by what I'm reading throughout, his ideas about commodity and so forth. Like, wow, this is insane. And then I go back to the introduction. And he says, all science is a search for a theory of nature, right? So far, we have theories of races and of creeds. And what he means is we have partial models of the universe, right? But we don't have the whole thing. And he says, when a true theory appears, we'll know it when we see it because its argument will be its own evidence. Its test is that it will explain all phenomena. I'm going to pause. I'll be right back. Do not like living in the Midwest, man. Allergies, allergies, allergies. Anyway, so its test is that it will explain all phenomena. So I'd been a really deep student of physics as I explored consciousness, particularly quantum. The work of theorist Ernest Laszlo really impacted my thinking early on. So did, Mr. Green, who did the first string theory book. Spent a lot, I can never say his name, the Japanese fella who's does a lot of M theory stuff. Michio Kaku, I'm terrible about saying his name. Spent a lot of time digesting their work. Thinking about the implications of their work. Thank you. And what's more, I've also had the good fortune to read Einstein twice before this point. I read Einstein as a freshman in college, both special and general relativity, and I also read Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams at the same time, which just reading that combination of books blew my mind. And then I was involved in another college in 2002 called Scheimer. That's a great books college. And they really featured Einstein's work really heavily. So as I really started to put everything together, I found myself thinking, okay, wait a minute. We've built an entire industry on science. No, we haven't. We've built an entire industry on a partial science that does not explain the entire universe. It goes exactly back to what Emerson's talking about. So far, we have races and creeds, but not a true theory. And I thought, well, shit. This partiality of our understanding, Einstein died miserable because he couldn't get the relativities to talk to quantum. They couldn't connect. The two worlds don't describe each other so far, we think, right? And M theory is really not getting us there in a very funny way when you think about it. String theory, M theory, is just a lot of money spent on splitting hairs. How many dimensions is this string going to vibrate into? Are you serious? This is what we're fighting about? We're literally splitting hairs. I love it. So, I found myself really challenged. I had worked up what I called the Verbic model of the universe, which really worked off of this idea that Heraclitus describes of logos in his work early, and also sort of jumped off of a lot of pre-Socratic and Socratic thinking in 2011. And that would end up turning out to be the foundation for a lot of the underlying ideas of what would become Bloom theory. But as I thought about what I wanted to do as an entrepreneur, which was ultimately continue my stepmother's work in climate change and really tackle and resolve that successfully, I found myself thinking really carefully and really rigorously that, hey, the problem at hand is that we've built a globe-spanning industry that is entirely cradled to grave in its thinking, which is a huge mistake. You can't treat a system like this like a toilet, industrially. It's a huge mistake. For so many reasons. I found myself thinking that the challenge before me, if I really wanted to make a difference in this movement, it really had to begin with fixing physics, believe it or not. And when I really sat down and just looked at physics and looked at it from a nuts and bolts perspective, okay? And so anytime I look at anything from a nuts and bolts perspective, I'm a behaviorist, so I always start with classical and operant conditioning, okay? When I studied geology, I find tons of evidence to support that operant and classical conditioning are hard at work in determining how crystals decide to form, right? Rewards, punishments, withdrawals, additions, those things are really, really important in the same way that zeros and ones are really, really important as a primal language for computers. And so when I look at the world, I always start with operant and classical conditioning, or classical and operant conditioning, with everything. I always started there with my finance work, and I definitely was going to start there looking at the extant problems and risks associated with what we're facing today in modern physics, which is that most of, oh God, why am I forgetting? Oh God, who wrote Principia Mathematica? Why am I forgetting his name? Shit! He's the most important physicist in history, and he's basically, my brain is just dumping his head out of my head. Anyway, Newton! There we go. A lot of Newton's work is okay with both quantum and the relativities, but the relativities and quantum don't want to talk, right? And so I asked myself, okay, so what's going on here? And I boiled everything down to sort of nuts and bolts. And I looked at, perceiving the world in terms of particles, which comes to us ultimately. We've inherited that from Lucretius, right? And I'm going, well, God, every time we refine our method of instrumentation, we always find that there are new particles. So why do we assume that one day we're going to find the floor? Every single time we change our instrumentation, we think we're going to find the new floor. There, we've got it. But instead, we find that the floor recedes ever from view, and there are new kinds of particles, or more stars, more galaxies. And And so there I thought, God, we've got kind of a bit of a problem on our hands because we're not acknowledging what it is that we're really seeing. The underlying patterns of what we're really seeing. There is no floor to all of this. There's no floor to all of this. The deeper you penetrate, the farther you can go. That's amazing. And then I really looked at Lucretius's idea of the atom, which goes on to inform quarks and, subatomic particles beyond that. And I thought, God, this is a really finite, limiting concept. It's obviously mistaken. Still, we're finding a lot of experimental evidence that it's the right path, but this is like, wait a minute. And then I sort of thought about things, and I'm like, well, God, we're talking about little balls, and we're talking about a lot of force and momentum, which are rods. This is all penis and testicle stuff. Maybe physics' problem is that it's an overwhelmingly masculine perspective. And maybe what it's missing to really understand and capture the universe in whole is that feminine perspective. And for me, there's nothing more feminine. I'm a gay man, and I worship and revere women. I'm a real weird gay man. I'm monogamous. I want children. I want to build a life with someone. I mean, if I were a straight man, I'd be awesome. I'd be the ideal father and spouse. But I'm just gay. But otherwise I have straight values, straight relationship values. It's very hard for me to find someone to partner with in this country because gay men don't want that. But that's neither here nor there. What's consequential is I'm looking at Emerson and I'm going, wait a minute. What is the womb that contains all things? And then I start thinking about a universe, right? And then from there, a galaxy. And then from there, a solar system. And then from there, planets. And then from there, organisms on planets. Atoms, molecules, right? What's interesting here is this is the clue. And that's what the tattoo's about. That's your clue. Right? Every single thing that this universe does, whether it's a phenomenon like me and you, or it's the relationship that we're having between each other right now, is a bloom. The currency of the universe is experience, and the universe is fundamentally at play, continuously discovering itself. This really affirms the work that, the reading that I did as a young man, oddly enough, with Neil Foster Wallace's Conversations with God, which assert the same thing about divinity, that God is fundamentally curious and discovering itself and at play. From there, I really strived to understand how blooms could function. And in order to do that, first I had to fix some of Einstein's work. So I spent some time doing a lot of theoretical work, and I wrote 4 additions to relativity. Oddly enough, I had enough to go with the 5th, which is on interiority, but I feared that introducing matter's interior depth and the progression of evolution to increase the depth and span of that on the other side of matter's mirror, as it were, might be too controversial. And part of the reason that I feel that way is because in order to make that argument, I want to really be able to talk about the Christian ichthyosis, the fish, which if you take that image and you connect the nose of one side of the fish, right, to its tail, and then do the same thing up above, what you've got is a map of 2 intersecting circles. And what Jesus and his followers knew that we don't know today is that we live at the intersection between the inner and the outer world. And the course of his teachings that I suspect are really suppressed is this consciousness work that really deepens the capacity of the inner to mirror the outer, okay? So to run you briefly through my physics work, Relativity 3 says your experience of time is subjective, and this tree experiences a very different subjective time than you do. A mountain experiences a very subjective time than you do. The planet experiences a very subjective time than you do. And when you change your subjective vantage in time and its relative variables, non-locality and superposition tell us that the states of matter that you perceive will change as well. So the planet doesn't experience itself as an orb circling a star. The planet experiences itself as a smeared, atomically smeared cord looping around our star. And it experiences its moon and the stars in the heavens as all smeared as well, right? That's its subjective experience of time. The mountain experiences you as a very long, erratic, crazy serpent. The planet, with many arms and many legs. The planet experiences us collectively as a virulent chemical foam, right? That might be transforming it for the better and might be transforming it for the worse. The evidence in our surrounding neighborhood is concerning. We have 2 dead planets that are our immediate neighbors that look like they were just like us at some point. And I don't think we should rule out anything about Mercury or the asteroid belt quite yet. I think we have a concerning interplanetary situation on our hands, and I suspect we're somehow involved ourselves in that frightening unwinding. Relativity 4 is really interesting. What it says is that once gravity and mass get pretty great, gravity actually impacts the spatial fabric. And it sort of works with, gravitational waves as well. It complements Einstein's ideas about gravitational waves. But going back really quickly to relativity 3, did you notice that? I just connected relativistic physics and quantum. Okay, so it can be done in relativity 3. It can be done, okay? So then you go to the gravitational fabric, and relativity 4 talks about how there's a certain point at which you can't really compress matter any further without really disrupting the spatial fabric and cracking it, and that will break a universe. So the universe installs these mechanisms, these physical mechanisms, to make sure that that doesn't happen. And essentially, when mass, gravity, and excessive spatial fabric get squanched, which is a Rick and Morty term, to such an extensive degree, they've got to go somewhere. So essentially, this is how suns get powered. Things get tunneled out and produce solar radiation, but the more you increase mass in stars from a result of fusion, right, and the generation of this spatial fabric crushing, the more mass they ultimately attain. So there's a problem here because eventually gravity is going to approach and exceed infinity, right? And that's when that's when black holes happen, but that's also when universes happen. That's where and when universes happen. And that's what we're finding with the James Webb Space Telescope now. I published that work in 2018, and James Webb is now starting to come back with some preliminary insights that are sort of highly suggestive that hypothesis is in fact true. I think the multiverse is a cascading foam of universes universing inside of black holes. The next is relativity 5. Relativity 5 is macroorganism theory, and it says very plainly that, first of all, we are cells in larger organisms, and some of those are mammalian, and some of those are parasitic. So an example of a mammalian organism would be the UNESCO World Heritage Site that you're building. Your team is prevailingly mammalian, right? But at the same time, when I go to Starbucks and buy a latte, I am acting as a cell in a larger multinational corporation, which is savaging the resource matrix of this planet. So I'm participating in a parasitic macroorganism. So there's sort of your differences there. I also think that the jury's out on this, but I think that ultimately we are grains in larger chemical systems. And I think that those chemical systems are planetarily transformative. The question is, are we catalytic? Or are we caustic? When you look at the curves, right, all the curves are parabolic. They describe something catalytic. That's where I have hope, particularly in this evolution argument. My hope for our species is that all of our transformative curves really indicate that we are building toward a really, really profound, extraordinary catalytic transformation as a species and as a planet. And that has me really optimistic. When you consider that we've done what we've done to the planet largely accidentally, that's astonishing emblem. That's an astonishing emblem of our ridiculous might. And the opportunity before us, really, is to harness that might with greater deliberateness and greater intentionality and far greater mastery. And rather than see ourselves behave as consumers or an invasive species, deliberately apply ourselves with economic rewards and economic reinforcements to the business of stewardship. I think that if we can successfully steward our planet, we become really eligible for inclusion in greater galactic civilization. Relativity 6 is extremely fun. It's a very long essay. It's my masterpiece. I'm missing some things, but the reason that I'm missing things is that if I were to give those bits away, you'd know how to time travel. And that's a little bit dangerous for everybody to know. So I just won't. Relativity 6 is a work on time. I will give you the rundown on just the, Christ-like proverb, right? So time is like a mountain stream, right? Sometimes you're in a stream and sometimes you're in a lake. That's time, okay? In a very, very high level nutshell. When you're in the stream, don't fight the current. Don't work against the current. Don't try and swim upstream. Determinism is your friend, right? Let the current carry you. Rest, coordinate your resources, and learn to gauge when you're going to arrive at a lake. That's where this consciousness work can really benefit you. When you get to a lake, there's no current. Boo-hoo, right? Not at all. Now's your time, right? This is the opportunity for free will to shine. This is the opportunity for you to make an impact. When you're in a stream, there's little you can do to create change. When you're in a lake, if you have teams, if you have resources that have joined you in that lake, if you have a motor or a sail or oars, you can do amazing things, right? So if you can learn to tell the difference between when you're in a temporal stream and when you're in a temporal lake, you can do remarkable things. The essay pairs songs with the inquiry and really looks at the underlying physics of events, which are those lakes, which have which are themselves attractors. And then the interstitial tissues that connect events, which you would think of as streams. And it looks at sort of the dynamics of how those play out. I've left a lot of thinking out about how that impacts the spatial fabric and the temporal fabric. Those two things do not want to be in the positions that they're put into, so they're always trying to resist change. So ultimately, time, we're continually living and reliving the same experiences in time, the same gaps between events. We don't even realize it. We're like walking back and forth and living completely intelligently in reverse parts of ourselves, and then walking forward again between these events. And what we're doing is over and over and over again, reinforcing the likelihood, the gravity of their likely occurrence, if that makes sense to you. Bloom theory is an extension from all of that. A really particularly time theory. And what I came up with Bloom theory is that ultimately Bloom theory is about the universe being at play. Blooms are all ultimately at play. Relationships are immensely important. Experience is the currency of being. And ultimately, a bloom is trying to assert its existence against all of the probabilities that want to cancel its existence out. And this is reinforced at the intersection of three domains of play: game, song, and story. And the reason that I'm late in really writing all of this down is that it's taken me 2 years. My family are all musicians, but because I had all my other talents, I never bothered to learn music. I figured I'd get there eventually. So in the last 2 years, I've learned guitar and piano and bass, and I've also learned music theory. So now I can talk about things like keys, which are hugely important. Understanding that how you begin something sets the tone for the entire endeavor, right? Well, that's a key change, right? So when you think about Bloom theory, start with game theory And here, if you haven't read Grant Morrison's graphic novel series, The Invisibles, I strongly encourage you to do so. Hi, Pheasant. Is there another one? Oh, yeah, there are. I strongly encourage you to read Grant Morrison's Invisibles if you haven't. On the subject of the game domain, try to remember it's only a game. Once you really, really, really wake up to all this shit, it's all a game. So when that pheasant popped out and I mentioned The Invisibles, that was either an affirmation that you've already read it or that you really should, right? That was a serendipity. That was a moment where the universe said, this is important. Click. Right? So you either already know that text, or the universe was really saying, hey, this is a good place for you to start. Right? It was affirming that that's a good connection. So waking up to that is really important. Speaking to the math that you sent me earlier, the fundamental mathematics that underlies game theory is 3011. Okay, so mapped out on a graph with an X and a Y axis. The 3 would be in the northern position, both the 1s would be in the east and the west, and the 0 would be in the south. Okay, so you start at the west, that's the incoming signal. Okay, that's where play begins. Someone else, Marco, right? Right, and then the 3 is computation. You get multiple rounds to think through, process the signal, round 1, produce a range of ideal responses, round 2, and narrow down what you want, round 3, right? And then the eastern one is the outgoing signal, polo, right? And then the 0 is the rest. That's where you take a break and you see what somebody else is going to do. That's the fundamental language of all gameplay. It's also a better numeric calculation system than binary. You can calculate every single number that you need to with those numbers. I do believe it's going to complement your model that you presented me with. My intuition is that the 2 dovetail beautifully. And I mean, my God, 3s are at the heart of everything I do, and you're sending me everything with 3s. Come on. Song is something that I'm only now really figuring out. Okay, so number 1, right? You know this, okay? Your blood. Okay, so let's talk about brains, okay? You do not have 1 brain. You have 3, okay? This is your enteric brain. Okay, this is the first to form. Pulmonary brain, second to form. Cephalic brain, third to form, okay? Okay, pulmonary brain. Your blood is the same pH and salinity as what? Right? The oceans, okay? What I love about Bloom theory and the song domain is what I'm doing right now, talking to you, all this carbon dioxide, all this voice, this doesn't come from my brain. This comes from my blood. This rises from my blood through my lungs and is only shaped on the way out by my brain. It's amazing. It's amazing. My singing to you right now is a product of my blood. I think that's so cool. And we've got all these cells going. I absolutely believe that our blood vessels, the blood in our vessels, are attenuated by big, big, big wave patterns exactly the same way the ocean is, you know? And so what I love about song theory is that it's about connection. It's about reporting. It's about connecting through the truth, right? And it's about attracting and building relationships and bonds and enticing people into positive relationships through those bonds by creating beautiful things to unite us together, right? And nature does the same thing with chemistry. You know, look at pheromones. That's song therapy and song domain in action. You know, when we form bonds with each other, it's largely through some sort of beautiful poetry that entices us to unite. You know, even magnetism functions in very much the same, you know, spooky action at a distance kind of way. What really delights me about learning Western music theory in the last 2 years now is I can really, as an artist, I get to finally compose in keys and chords and notes. And it's just completely changed my entire creative process. But as a theorist, that's not a word, theorist, as a theorist, it's given me this entire language to be able to talk about this range of experiences. And I think my takeaway for you for song domain is simply this. How we begin things is incredibly important because it sets the tone for everything that follows. And that's what keys in music really teach us. You know, it's the same bunches of chords over and over again, but the order that you play them in and the one you start them with first colors everything that follows. And Bloom theory really teaches us the same thing about song domain. And then there's story. What do I say about story? You're made of atoms. That's a chemical alphabet, dude. You're a walking, talking, living, self-editing through diet and excretion text. And then you're governed by these massive archetypal processes, whether it's the syntactic underlying processes of your genes, or it's the overarching archetypal processes such as your psychological personality types. If you're a fan of astrology like I am, I'm a big proponent. Like, man, this is a great Venus retrograde for me. Leo is treating me really well. Yeah, I mean, these larger archetypal journeys really define us. So when I set out on my journey, I absolutely invoked James Campbell's hero's journey on myself as a magician to condition the transformations necessary to make all of this happen, both in terms of an experience of myself and sort of an experience of my consciousness that would, result, And by the same token, I also, invoked Plato's allegory of the cave and asked that I find a solution to that, which is, I very much have. So that's kind of... Story is a bit more dynamic. It looks at the syntactical, and it also looks at the archetypal. So what is the story at, say, there's the story you're living, but then there's also the story you're eating, which is very much the story that you're living, right? Like, what goes into your mouth is very much an essential part of your story. In my culture, we don't think about what we eat. But what we eat is a direct connection to everything around us. Right? That's how we unite with the world. It isn't through speech, it isn't through art, it isn't through commodity and industry, and it isn't through sex. It's through diet. So ultimately, the story domain has to begin and end with dietary understandings. But at the same time, what the story domain can comfort us with, again and again and again, going back to behaviors, is you can look at the history of behaviors for similar stories, right? And based on those outcomes from those similar stories, behaviors, you can reasonably plan for what your story will resolve as, and you can try and avert that outcome if it's adverse. So that's a rundown of some of my philosophical work. I hope you enjoy it. Let's talk soon. I'm really enjoying this. Best, Jamie.